Yes, obviously, the entire world knows that Jeffrey Epstein was their asset. He was working for them, obviously, okay?
So recently, Candace Owens had a podcast about Jeffrey Epstein and his background, the truth about it, why it's so hidden and why no one wants to cover it, and who he was actually working for. So let's get Candace's take on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
So I'm going to slow everything down for you so you can truly appreciate how absurd this story is. First and foremost, and this is my favorite part of the Jeffrey Epstein story, is that he is a man who became a billionaire. And the strangest part about his billionaire status is that nobody knows how he became a billionaire. Yeah, they can't tell us that. That's my favorite part of the whole thing is just like Chris, my editor, mentioned earlier, you don't pay 8 cents of tax money and they'll be like, right here, my friends. You shorted the government 8 cents. But Jeffrey Epstein, we don't know where he got his billions of dollars. The real story actually begins with a man named Donald Barr. Okay, Donald Barr. And if you're listening to that right now and thinking, Candace, that surname sounds strangely familiar to you, well, it is because he is, in fact, Bill Barr's father. Bill Barr, who worked for the CIA and then became the U.S. Attorney General under George H.W. Bush, and then again under Donald Trump's first term. Yeah, that Bill Barr. His dad was Donald Barr. And his dad was actually a pretty interesting character, I got to tell you, because he published this book in 1973, a science fiction book. I want to be clear, it's fiction. And it was entitled Space Relations. And this totally fiction book told the story about a planet that is ruled by oligarchs who engage in child sex slavery. Wow, that is really weird. Per Wikipedia, they write, quote, it has been noted that the plot of the novel anticipates the crimes of Epstein and his accomplice, Ghislaine Maxwell. And even more interesting, by the way, is that this planet that is engaging in this child sex trafficking is known as the Kossars. Let me spell that for you. Kossar, not to be confused with Khazars. But I did decide to look into the word Kossar, Kossar, and it does, it actually is a surname from Eastern European Slavic area. But don't let you get caught up here, okay?
Yeah, this is interesting. I haven't actually heard this Barr connection, so I'm interested to see what she says about that. But I will say about what she said originally that, no one knows how Epstein became a billionaire. That's absolutely true. It is known how he acquired large sums of his money, though, and large sums of his fortune, because he worked for Les Wexner as a tax specialist. So this billionaire, for some reason, hires this guy essentially off the street. He didn't have a major Wall Street background. He apparently was in Wall Street for a while. He was actually a failed math teacher that got dismissed because it seems like he liked to hang out with the students. But he got dismissed from that, and then he was picked up by Les Wexner, of all people, rich billionaire, connections to the Israeli government, by the way, and he made his fortune by owning Victoria's Secret, and the parent company of Victoria's Secret also owned many other companies. He gave several hundred millions of dollars to Epstein, presumably because he helped him so much on his taxes in ways that, no one else could have helped him with. And this is just such a weird story and explains part of it, but we don't even have the full explanation for all of it.
Anyways, in this intergalactic plot, there is this group of people who are political extremists, and they are ruled by oligarchs, and they settle this colony in the middle of nowhere because they're political extremists. And they're actually, it says on Wikipedia, they are bored because they just have so much power, such absolute power. They never get in trouble for anything. They can do whatever they want, these Kossars, and they're bored with their power, and they have an ambassador that's helping them to be welcomed back into the wider empire, because the wider empire is actually not down with their slave-owning society. They don't allow them to kidnap human beings and to trade them. That's so strange, right? Very interesting story that Barr was, it's a totally fictional story that he was telling. Vice actually read the book by a journalist named Becky Ferreira, and she describes the novel as highly unsettling due to its depiction of rape of enslaved people, particularly teenage girls, and other coercive sex acts. The sex acts described are performed, quote, for the dual purposes of entertainment and controlled procreation. And she views the novel as sexualizing minors and fetishizing rape. That seems really weird. But Barr, Daddy Barr, wrote this book.
Well, interesting. I want to see how this connects to Epstein or Bill Barr, actually, and I'm sure she'll explain that. But, this is a fictional tale, but there are seemingly a lot of things that are reminiscent from what we've experienced the last few years with the Epstein story, isn't there? And that's only come to light even more in recent days when the Trump administration, when the DOJ and FBI released that memo saying that, one, there's no evidence that a client list exists, despite the fact that Pam Bondi's on film saying that it was on her desk just months ago, and that there's no evidence that he killed himself. Of course.
I got to tell you something else about him, because it's quite interesting, because it does end up being a lot of what Jeffrey Epstein was accused of and was taking place was actually doing. At the time that his book was published, even more interestingly, Donnie Barr was the headmaster of a school. Wow, could you imagine sending your kid to the school and then this guy publishes this book about child sex exploitation? Anyways, he was the headmaster of a school called the Dalton School in New York. And while he was the headmaster, a young Jeffrey Epstein was selected to become a math teacher at this school. Jeffrey Epstein, by the way, was just 21 at the time. Donnie Barr's the headmaster. Jeffrey Epstein becomes a math teacher. And I got to tell you why that's weird. First and foremost, because Jeffrey Epstein only had a high school degree. He didn't have any teaching certifications. He had dropped out of this mathematics program at NYU. Yet under Donald Barr's stewardship, while he's writing this book on the side, Jeffrey Epstein is plucked from obscurity to teach at one of the most prestigious schools in Manhattan. So prestigious, by the way, that today, tuition is $65,000 per year. By the way, I should tell you, Barr himself was a bit controversial. He actually made several unconventional hires at this school during his tenure. And soon after Jeffrey was hired as a teacher, he had to resign amid some controversy.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I actually have a background in education. My degree is in education. I've never officially worked in that capacity, but I can tell you, at least today, I can't speak to back then, it's highly restrictive about licensing, about acquiring a teacher's license in almost every state. And that being like the bare minimum prerequisite to becoming a teacher. So yeah, that's unconventional. A lot of unconventional things happen the rest of his life that don't really explain how he made such a fortune, but I'm glad she's covering this too.
I'm not going to get down that rabbit hole for you, but yeah, he's an interesting character. And you are probably not going to be shocked, but while Epstein was there as a teacher, he was inappropriate with the young female students. He attended parties with them. We'll talk about this in the future. Anyways, this unqualified, or at least underqualified, creepy Epstein, who only had a high school diploma, then magically gets a job in finance. Again, zero qualifications. He just somehow became friends with the CEO of Bear Stearns. So in 1976, he joins this firm as a low-level junior assistant to a trader, because again, he doesn't have any qualifications. So he's just assisting, not even the executive assistant, the junior assistant to a trader. But magically, you guys, you're not going to believe me, just 4 years later, that junior assistant, Jeffrey Epstein, became a partner of the firm. I kid you not. He was made a partner of the firm at the age of 27 with zero financial background. It's giving Emmanuel Macron. It's giving like someone more powerful is just kind of pulling me up through the ranks, and I'm allowed to do that for whatever reason. I don't know. That's just, I'm getting a vibe here.
Yeah, absolutely. In three distinct circumstances, not only being plucked out of obscurity to be a teacher, and now to be part of this hedge fund that he was part of on Wall Street as a junior trader without certifications. I don't know what existed back then, but, Sigma 7 certifications are necessary for, financial advisors for the most part, and there's other certifications that are required for that. Again, different time. And then later, he's plucked up out of obscurity by Les Wexner. I can never say the name. Les Wexner. Out of obscurity. to do his taxes, and then that's why he got hundreds of millions of dollars. None of this makes sense unless there was some connection to intelligence services. The paper trail does not comport to reality in terms of how these things work. There's no explanation really for this happening outside of, what they call conspiracy theorists and what they say.
Just sounds very familiar to me. Anyways, just 1 year later, he actually had to leave that firm, even though he just made partner, because he was found guilty of an SEC violation. So partook in a little bit of fraud, very quickly had to resign. But it's all good because then he just started his own consulting firm, because obviously he's super qualified to do that, to start consulting for billionaires and governments, because that's what he did. He establishes like Epstein and Co. at the age of 28, and he begins consulting for governments and extremely wealthy clients. Some of those clients, by the way, who have embezzled funds from people. I'll give you just one example. This guy, Stephen Hoffenberg, hired Epstein in 1987 as a consultant for his Towers Financial Corporation. And while Jeffrey Epstein was consulting for Towers Financial Corporation, they happened to take part in the largest Ponzi scheme ever recorded until Bernie Madoff came some years later. Oh, darn. Once again, Epstein's just caught up in a little bit of fraud.
I don't know if that's the largest Ponzi scheme that's ever existed, because something called Social Security exists, by the way. But still, the point's well made.
That didn't give the other elites, the other millionaires and billionaires, any pause to continue working with him. No, they just kept hiring this guy. And his most significant consulting relationship began with Leslie Wexner. Now, if that name sounds familiar to you,
here we go.
It has been alleged that Epstein made millions because he was managing Leslie Wexner's affairs, millions. Far cry from billions, but Leslie, you might recognize Wexner because he is the owner of many retail stores. Abercrombie & Fitch, Victoria's Secret, I think is probably the one that he's most known for. Lane Bryant, just the L brands in general. Leslie, for whatever reason, just felt that Jeffrey Epstein should just be given control of everything. Power of attorney, make hiring decisions, firing decisions. He really empowered this Jeffrey Epstein. And for whatever reason, while Epstein was empowered, when executives at the company would come forward and say, hey, this Jeffrey Epstein is kind of a creep. He's posing as a recruiter for Victoria's Secret models, and he's getting access to these women. That was completely ignored. Of course, we know what happens next. Epstein, or during this time frame, he is throwing parties for the elite of the elites. Everyone who wasn't anybody is obviously at a Jeffrey Epstein party. He is the guy to know. His sidekick there, Ghislaine Maxwell, we'll discuss her briefly in a bit. Fast forward to 2006, bad year for our boy Epstein. Bad year. In early 2006, Epstein was actually charged in Florida with multiple counts of molestation and unlawful sexual activity with a minor.
And he got off on a plea bargain by Alexander Acosta, who actually admitted that, hey, I was just taking it easy on him because I heard he was connected to intelligence. And that's a particularly damning statement that very few people bring up now. But yeah, Epstein had this rise to fame and notoriety that you couldn't make up in the most obscure novel you would ever write. The craziest movie, the most elaborate tale you could ever draw up isn't even crazy enough to support what actually happened to this guy in real life. And that's why so many people have so many questions about Epstein's past. And I'm really glad that Candace is exploring it here because, a lot of the things we talk about related to Epstein come much later. But let's see what her take is on 2006 and how this all played out. It was treacherous for the victims that he was a criminal and affected their lives. They never will receive justice in the way that they should because of the government cover-up of this. But 2006 was a horrific year in all of it.
Clear, the FBI was able to confirm for 34 minors. They were able to confirm their stories had been corroborated, that they had been abused by him. That number was then increased to 40 by the time he signed this really interesting plea deal, okay? Now, to just let you know what he was up to, the details from the investigation included allegations that 12-year-old triplets were flown in from France, interesting place, for Epstein's birthday, and then flown back following the day after they had been sexually abused by him.
It's just so sick and twisted. It's hard for me to even continue watching this. My stomach's just churning at the monstrosity that this guy was and the sex ring that he conducted. And for the government to just conceal this under a rug, to pretend like there's no victims, like they don't know who he trafficked to, despite the fact that Ghislaine Maxwell is behind bars for 20 years with apparently no evidence to convict her because they won't release anything related to the victims. It's just absurd on the deepest levels, and I just had to pause and say that. It's just, it's sickening in so many ways.
It was alleged that the young girls were being recruited from Brazil, from South American countries, from former Soviet countries, Europe, and that a certain Jean-Luc Brunel, who ran the modeling agency, which was funded by Epstein, known as MC2, was supplying these young girls to Epstein. Now, Jean-Luc Brunel, again, we're not going to get sidetracked here. He's a French guy. A lot of things that are just going to cross with the Epstein and the French and everything we've uncovered about Emmanuel Macron. But we can't speak to Jean-Luc today because you're not going to believe this, guys. Jean-Luc got arrested, and when he was in a cell, he committed suicide by hanging himself. Yeah. So that's another dead end. He committed suicide, sadly.
Jean-Luc Brunel didn't kill himself. In this story, there's so many of those moments. There's Epstein himself, and there's Virginia Giuffre. Just a few months ago, committed suicide and killed herself, right? That's the narrative, but there's too many oddities in this to make sense of it. It's just too crazy.
Anyways, oddly, Jeffrey Epstein, despite everything, all of his guilt, he was delivered this amazing deal. Caught red-handed, and yet Alexander Acosta, who was then the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Florida, handed him a very light sentence, and the deal was incredible, okay? First and foremost, the deal granted immunity to any of his potential co-conspirators. So it's like they're investigating the feds, and they're like, okay, this guy's got something to do. Oh, these people, everyone's involved. We're just going to go ahead and grant immunity to those people. The prosecutors also agreed that they would keep the deal that they made with Jeffrey Epstein a secret from his victims so that the victims could not challenge it in court. So they just get a phone call, found out that Jeffrey Epstein, we already dealt with that.
Yeah, and they sure did grant immunity to everyone else involved in this sex ring, especially recently. That mantra and that precedent has held tightly throughout both the Biden and the Trump administrations too, as we just learned from that DOJ and FBI memo. It's just crazy how this whole thing was treated. It's an obvious cover-up on so many levels. And you know why it's a cover-up? Because it reaches into the highest levels of our government, and probably foreign governments, and probably a foreign government in the Middle East that Epstein had two very strong associations with, actually three. Ehud Barak was a good friend of his, former Prime Minister of Israel. Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, a Mossad agent, a known Mossad agent. Les Wexner, associations with the Israeli government as well. That's what we're dealing with here. This is not, just some kind of whimsical, shoot from the hip mentality that we have in these associations. Occam's razor tells us what the most likely scenario was, and it was that he was an intelligence asset, blackmailing prominent politicians, because there's no more power that you can have over politicians than to have that kind of material on them, to bend them to your will. That's what we actually really saw.
He actually signed what's known as a non-prosecution agreement with federal prosecutors. So in the end, he pled guilty to just one count of solicitation of prostitution and one count of procurement of minors for prostitution. And what they gave him was a sentence of 13 months in county jail. And I want to be clear that when he got sentenced this, he was allowed to leave to work at his office and to go for walks. In fact, this part is actually so incredible that I want to read this straight from the Wikipedia page because I can't even do it justice. Now, Wikipedia is just pulling, you can go and fact check these. This is from like the Washington Post, other sources, but it reads, while most convicted sex offenders in Florida are sent to state prison, Epstein was instead housed in a private wing of the Palm Beach County Stockade. That's the sheriff's office, just so you guys are clear. He was just housed in a private wing of the sheriff's office. And according to the sheriff's office, was for 3.5 months allowed to leave the jail on work release for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. So for 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, Jeffrey Epstein was allowed to leave. Now, when he was actually in his private cell, the door was open. Epstein's cell door was left unlocked, and he had access to the attorney room where a television was installed for him. Let me make that clear. So he is not only allowed to leave his room whenever he wants, allowed to leave the sheriff's office for 12 hours a day, including one day of the weekend, because it's 6 days a week. They also went through an effort to install a television for him in the attorney's room. Not even the attorneys got that, but they installed one for him.
They literally rolled out the red carpet for this villain after sexual offenses, after absurdly disgusting sexual offenses. Everything about this story doesn't make sense except for if there's a grand cover-up. And this is just another element, how he was handled after his conviction, after the plea bargain from Acosta. Just think of this. He was treated so differently than virtually any other criminal that ever existed, especially under these kind of charges. It's just insurmountable to not conclude that there's a cover-up here. And that cover-up stretches far and wide. It stretches throughout both political parties, all people of prominence that were involved with this. And we'll never get the answers that we deserve and the victims deserve, because the victims are being effectively forgotten. Not only forgotten, but essentially spat upon in all this.
Okay, great. That's before they moved him into their previously unstaffed infirmary. Now, the sheriff's office, if you're wondering what they got, Jeffrey Epstein, right before he turned himself over, he established this not-for-profit. And from that not-for-profit, while he was in jail, he paid the sheriff's office $128,000. And that was for extra service that they had provided him during his work release. And what extra services did they provide Jeffrey Epstein during his work release? Well, he wanted to make sure that his office, his off-campus office, was monitored by permit deputies and that their overtime was paid for by Epstein. And he made sure that those deputies that were coming with him to work wore suits and that they checked in his guests at his front desk. So the sheriffs, while he was going to work, came with him. He paid them for overtime. He wanted them to wear suits, and they were responsible for checking in his guests. This is while he's in jail serving his sentence, okay? Now,
yeah, he's treated like he's running the whole establishment. This is like Andy Dufresne, but with the power of the warden in Shawshank Redemption. But he's the one calling the shots here, despite the fact that he's convicted. He's basically being treated like royalty in this place, in this private wing with a television and with guests that he's operating. It's just too insane. There's so many angles of this story that are so unbelievable that no one could possibly believe it. Again, if this was a movie, no one would believe this.
Later, the sheriff's office would say that the guest logs were destroyed. So we don't know who they were checking in for anyways. Epstein served almost 13 months, if we're calling that serving, before he was released in 2009 for a year of probation on house arrest. Now, I want to be clear, house arrest for Jeffrey Epstein looked a little different, okay? While on probation, he was allowed to go on numerous trips because he doesn't have just one house, you guys. So he was allowed to take his corporate jet to his residences in Manhattan, in the U.S. Virgin Islands. He was also, because you can imagine he didn't get a lot of exercise in his houses, he was allowed to go on long shopping trips and walks all around Palm Beach for quote unquote exercise. Actually, I actually do think he probably had a gym in all of these houses. But the point is he wanted fresh air exercise. So he needed these long walks throughout Palm Beach.
So how is this a punishment whatsoever? This seems indistinguishable from how he led the rest of his life. He can go anywhere he wants, go to whichever resident he wants, abuse whoever he wants to abuse, because the abuse continued, as we know after this. He can just walk out on the street, go to any residence. Again, he was treated like no one else in this situation would have been treated. And I think there's reasons for it. I think, again, Occam's razor shows that he was connected to intelligence. And that's what Acosta said at one point. Again, that's been kind of obfuscated. That's been kind of ignored, swept under the rug, kind of spun in so many different ways. But that is the most likely tale here. That's the most likely lesson here. And that is why probably the Trump administration and the Biden administration have done everything they can to bury everything there is about this story.
Epstein was also allowed to use his own driver to drive him between jail and his office and other appointments. Now, you're probably thinking around now, why on earth would Alex Acosta agree to that? What's he doing? Why would you allow this man guilty as sin to essentially just run a sheriff's office for a few months and then do whatever he wants thereafter? Well, Alex Acosta faced a lot of pressure when Trump nominated him for Secretary of Labor. And he told reporters years later that it wasn't in his control. He said, quote, "I was told that Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone, and that Epstein was above my pay grade."
Yeah.
Excuse me, above the pay grade of the Attorney General of the Southern District of Florida? Who exactly is paying Epstein? What colony of COSARs, what are we calling them, could be so powerful, almost bored with their power, if we're going back to this space book, bored with their power, that they would allow this to take place and have confidence, know fully well that even if they get caught, who cares? I mean, you'd have to be so powerful and so politically extremist, like that book suggests, that you could, like, I don't know, sink the USS Liberty, maybe shoot a sitting president in broad daylight while you're at it, and still have politicians referring to you as friends and allies. Anyways, let's not get lost here. There are some more interesting facts about Jeffrey Epstein. One, he had a working fake passport. That's incredible. He had an Austrian passport with a totally fake name that placed his residence in Saudi Arabia, and it worked. So yeah, he was a Fed. Obviously, he was very high up in the deep state, and he used this passport to enter countries throughout the 1980s when he was very young, the 1980s, guys.
Yeah, there's so many angles to this. He was certainly connected to some governmental agency, whether or not it was the CIA or Mossad, one of them. I think the most likely answer is Mossad, given his connections, given what Acosta said about this, and given who he hung out with. Ehud Barak on many occasions. Ehud Barak was one of his most frequent visitors when he hung out with prominent people. Les Wexner, obviously, and Robert Maxwell, we know that there are connections that exist. He was involved to some extent.
Including the United Kingdom, Spain, Saudi Arabia. He also had a very compelling interest in artwork, okay? And you've probably seen this. He had this artwork of Bill Clinton in Monica Lewinsky's dress above his desk. And that's interesting in general, because I don't know if you know this, but President Clinton was blackmailed. He was blackmailed by Israel because they wanted to get this deal done with the Palestinian Authority, and also were pressuring him to release one of their assets, Jonathan Pollard. Now, Jonathan Pollard, to give you a background here, was another agent of Israel. He was actually a CIA analyst who was found guilty and went to prison for 30 years for spying on behalf of Israel. So he worked for the U.S. government, but he was spying on behalf of Israel. Anyways, this is according to the Times of Israel. Let's take a look at what happened. Netanyahu said to have offered Lewinsky tapes for Pollard. Okay.
Yeah, this is the most crazy angle about the whole thing, and Ian Carroll has talked a little bit about this too, but Pollard was actually convicted of spying for Israel within the CIA, and he eventually, his handler was pardoned by Trump, I believe on the last day of Trump's first presidency. I think it was January 20th of 2021. He pardoned Sellers, the handler of Pollard, for spying on behalf of Israel. But this angle is crazy too.
It reads in this article that Israel attempted to use tapes of the former U.S. President Bill Clinton's steamy conversations with intern Monica Lewinsky to leverage the release of Jonathan Pollard. That's at least what the book regarding the Clinton family was claiming. The book is entitled Clinton Inc. and the subtitle is The Audacious Rebuilding of a Political Machine. And the author, Daniel Halper, relies on the record interviews with former officials, together with a close analysis of documents that were termed the quote unquote Monica files. And it tells the story of one of the most prominent political families in the United States, being the Clintons. According to the author, the documents indicate that during the Y plantation talks, so these were plantation talks it was held on the Y plantation in Maryland, okay, between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And Bill Clinton was in the middle of this because, just always drama happening there in 1998.
Yeah.
And Netanyahu wasn't getting what he wanted. So Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, our dear friend and ally, pulled Bill Clinton aside and he presses, first and foremost, for the release of Jonathan Pollard. This is directly from the Times of Israel article. I'm going to read this quote. The Israelis present at Y River had a new tactic for their negotiations. They'd overheard Clinton and Monica, and they had it on tape. Not wanting to directly threaten the powerful American president, a crucial Israeli ally, Clinton was told that the Israeli government had thrown the tapes away. But the very mention of them was enough to constitute a form of blackmail, Halper wrote, adding that, quote, according to information provided by a CIA source, a stricken Clinton appeared to buckle.
Indeed, and Netanyahu had reason to dislike Clinton because he had embraced what was called the clean break strategy, this mentality that they should actually get involved in wars, regional wars within the Middle East, rather than to subscribe to what was known as the Oslo Accords, an agreement to maintain peaceable relations with neighboring countries that they hadn't before, including Egypt, which has mostly been peaceable, their relationship with Egypt, since the 1970s. But that was a break. The clean break had decided to make war with these countries, overthrow them. We don't have to make peace with them anymore. And guess who we're going to get to enlist to help us with that? The United States. So what they did was embrace the clean break strategy, but here's Bill Clinton in the 1990s essentially promoting a dual state solution, a two-state solution that would include a Palestinian state. Now that seems like an extremist position now, but that was the position of several U.S. presidents actually at the time. And now if you bring that up, you're just a Hamas sympathizer, right? If you have that idea. But back then, that was not good enough for Netanyahu, who wanted to eliminate the Palestinians and wanted to eliminate the possibility of a Palestinian state. And all of his policies since then have followed from that dictum, the clean break strategy. So, Bill Clinton was a thorn in his side to some extent.
Our friend and ally is at it again, you guys. Yep, they're at it again. Hey, just want to let you know, I have tapes of you with Monica Lewinsky, but I'm going to throw them away. Oh, I don't know. Why do you have tapes of what took place in the White House? What's going on? Should we ask questions? No, we shouldn't ask questions. We should never just ask questions. Anyways, yes, obviously, the entire world knows that Jeffrey Epstein was their asset. He was working for them, obviously, okay? From Ghislaine Maxwell and her father's involvement with the Mossad and who attended his funeral. Les Wexner, look up everything that he donates to. I mean, he's essentially, he works for Israel. This is like a known fact. But you guys, I want you to be calm. It's all good. Because now the Department of Justice has come out and they say that Jeffrey Epstein, he had no list.
Yeah, of course they did. But bravo, Candace Owens. This is one of the best examinations and analyses I've seen on Jeffrey Epstein's life and his background and kind of his rise to power and his fame and all the absurd things that happened in the lead up to 2019 that we don't get covered in other places, especially in regard to what Acosta said, his connections to various people that were not only Mossad agents, but associated closely with the Israeli government, and we'll never get all the answers that we deserve. Kash Patel and Pam Bondi are part of it. Trump's part of it. I hate to say that. If you're a Trump supporter and support him for the release of the Epstein files, well, you're not getting it. And I'm not gloating. I really wish that would have happened. I truly do. But it's as Dan Carlin says, it's a big club, and you're not a part of it. You're not in the club. I'm not in the club. You know who is? The people in power that are protecting others that are in power that were involved in this sex trafficking ring. And it's probably government officials, lobbyists, and people of prominence throughout the US, throughout the UK. We know Prince Andrew was involved in this whole thing, and probably other countries as well, including Israel. So Jeffrey Epstein, he deserves to just be rotting. And I hate to I'm a Christian and I don't like to say that about people, but if there's anyone that deserves it, it seems like it's Jeffrey Epstein. And man, his victims will never get the justice they deserve. And that's probably the worst part of this whole thing, is that the victims are just this afterthought. They're pretending that they don't exist, and the clients don't exist, and no information exists. And we can't divulge anything now, except for this stupid video that they released that has a time skip of about 1.5 minutes. Even the video that they carefully constructed and edited for public perception to say, hey, you know, he really did kill himself. Not only doesn't it show his cell and himself in the cell, it doesn't show that, of course. Those cameras malfunctioned, right? Kash Patel seemed to say, oh, no, they didn't. We have the footage. You're going to see it. That didn't happen. We saw outside of his cell, the commons area, where there's a timestamp jump. And it's not the 10 hours that we expect, by the way, if it's the entire night's duration, to show that no one entered. There's so many holes to be poked through this. It's crazy. You know, I would hate to be Caroline Leavitt right now trying to field these questions in a way, because, you know, corporate journalists are not going to ask the most pressing questions about this. Steve Doocy, to his credit, actually asked a very good one about the inconsistencies yesterday, and she just spun it. She deflected it. I feel like Trump's most zealous supporters won't ask many questions, but you can tell. Just look at social media right now. Not all of the conservative influencers are very happy about this, and there's some significant pushback. What needs to happen is more clamoring over this, more talking about it. Do not let this story die. They betrayed you. They were involved in a sex trafficking ring. Epstein's true story is being swept under the rug, and you're supposed to swallow it just like you swallow the war propaganda and the propaganda about COVID and the lockdowns. That's what you're supposed to do because of this. But I do want to hear from you. Let me know in the comments below. Is Candace Owens right? Was Epstein working for Mossad? Was he working for the CIA? What's the most under-discussed part of this entire story? Let me know down below in the comments. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Candace Owens too. She's awesome. Love the fact she's covering this story to the nth degree more than almost anyone else out there. And please consider becoming a YouTube member of me. Click the join button below if you'd like to do that. Not only would you support me, and I appreciate that if you do that, you get access to all my videos before they go live on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.